Thank you for joining me for this study of Jeremiah in the Lifeway series. This is session 6. The text is Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 1 to 12. The title is Ruler. And the lesson summary statement is God promises to give his people a trustworthy, righteous ruler. I'm using the suggestion to go explore the Bible, and I'm going to start with the questions on the board that it recommends in the second section called Focus Attention. What was your worst job? What made it so tough? I'll have that on the board as the class comes in, and so they'll have some things going on in their minds when it's time to start the class. And then I'm just going to follow the suggestions in there. It's talking about the difficulty of leadership and the impact that it has upon employees. One of the things it says, the article notes that some 75% of American workers believe the worst part of their life is their immediate boss. That's huge. One of the things I'm going to do is count the number of people in my class, and then I'm going to try and use as a representative example our class and say, 75%, that represents 12 of the people in this class would say the worst part of their life is their immediate boss. I mean, that's what we're talking about. Just kind of help visualize what it means when we're using these percentages. For example, about 35% have left a job they liked because of their bad boss. Well, then what would that represent in terms of our class? Just try and help make that come to life more for them. But look how hopeful this lesson summary statement is. God promises, that means it's a certitude. God always keeps his promises. God promises, it's certain to happen, to give his people a trustworthy. This is a ruler that's worthy of your confidence. It's a ruler that's dependable. God promises to give his people a trustworthy and a righteous ruler. Righteous, he does right. He is right. He makes good decisions. This is who is going to be our leader. And this is the point of this lesson in chapter 23, verses 1 to 12. Now the nation is hanging on by a thread. The leaders of the nation are leading them to destruction, and they could care less because they're only concerned about themselves. And God sends this message to the people of Judah through the prophet Jeremiah and says, one day God promises to give you a leader who is trustworthy and righteous. Now Jeremiah bases what he's saying on two promises that God's made in the past. One is to Abraham, where God promised Abraham he would give him a land, he would give him a blessing, and he would give him innumerable descendants. And the second promise is the promise to David, that God will establish David's kingdom forever. Those two promises are the biblical basis for what Jeremiah is saying to the people here in Jeremiah 23. Now, chapter 11 to 29 in Jeremiah shows how Jeremiah was received by the kings and other leaders of that day. And chapter 11 to 20 shows that their response to him was a hostile response. And when you come to the end of chapter 20, you could imagine Jeremiah is discouraged and he's feeling overwhelmed by what he's faced in terms of opposition. In chapter 21 to 29, God responds to these hostile leaders by saying basically two things. One is, I'm going to bring them in judgment. And number two, I'm going to give my people a new leader. So chapter 23 is in that section. And the chapter can be divided into two parts. You may want to write this on the board for your class to help them see it. But the first is the plan of God, verses 1 to 8. And the plan of God is to give them this new leader, this messianic leader. He's going to judge their bad leaders. He's going to replace them with a new leader. That's God's plan. And then the second part of chapter 23 is the problem with the people. And how is God going to deal with this problem? And it's mainly false teachers. And the rest of that chapter, verses 9 to 40, is talking about this impending judgment that's going to come on the false teachers. There's going to be disaster for them. So the plan of God, verses 1 to 8, and then dealing with the problem, verses 9 through 20. So, what is God's plan? Verses 1 to 8. Well, you'll see it in the outline of our lesson. God's plan is a new shepherd. That's verses 1 to 4. God's plan is the righteous branch, verses 5 to 8. And then how's he going to deal with the problem? He's going to bring impending disaster upon these false teachers. So let's look at the first point, new shepherds, Jeremiah 23, verses 1 to 4. Now, I'm going to ask someone to read the text, and as they read it, I'm going to have half the class look for the characteristics of the unfaithful shepherds. The characteristics of the unfaithful shepherds. And I'm going to ask the other half of the class to look for characteristics of God's response. Sometimes I'll divide this up with men looking for one, women looking for the other. Sometimes I just divide the class in half. But I'm going to ask someone to read it, and then I'll get responses from them. First, what are the characteristics of unfaithful shepherds? And what I'm going to do is we get responses. I'm going to use that as a way to get into the text and give explanation for what Jeremiah is saying in these first 4 verses. Let me just look at some of the text with you. You have good explanation in your leader's guide. Maybe this would add some to your understanding of the text. It begins in verse 1, woe to the shepherds. Now the word woe is a cry of lament. At the same time, it's a dire warning. Something terrible is going to happen. And so there is this word of woe. And no, the woe is to the shepherds. That was a common phrase in the Old Testament to describe the leaders in that day. Woe to the shepherds. Now, why is there this cry of lament? What is this terrible tragedy that's going to come? It's because of, why is it coming? Woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture. That's a reference to the exile that's going to be coming. The people are going to be destroyed. Many will die. Many will be carried off. The rest will be left in poverty, and they're going to be scattered. He places the blame squarely on the shoulders of the leaders. Woe to the shepherds. You're the ones who destroy and scatter the sheep, notice, of my pasture. These sheep belong to God. These are the under-shepherds. This is how they have treated God's sheep. If we could change the term to children. These people are God's children. They were given care over God's children, and they neglected God's children. Now imagine how God feels about that and what God's going to respond to this. So these scattered the sheep of my pasture. This is the Lord's declaration. This is not a pundit's opinion. It's not some insightful person of the day that's looking at the events. This is God's word to these leaders. Verse 2, therefore, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says about the shepherds who tend my flock. So there is this woe that starts at verse 1, and then in verse 2, this woe article is followed by a pronouncement of judgment. So here's the judgment. You have scattered my flock, banished them, and have not attended to them. I'm about to attend to you because of your evil acts. This is the Lord's declaration. He emphasizes again that this congregation belongs to God. And since they belong to God, they are His special concern. And they should have been of special concern to the shepherds. And He has banished them. The Leader's Guide says about banish that it's a very strong word, and it means that they intentionally disregarded God's people. They're more concerned about their needs and give no thought to the needs of the people. And the word attended has about it careful attention. They didn't give careful attention to the people, but God's going to give careful attention to the false shepherds And that is, he's going to give careful thought to how he's going to deal with them in justice. Now, as a Sunday school teacher, your first responsibility is to prepare to teach the Word of God. The sheep need to be fed the Word of God. But you're also their shepherd. And that means that there are other needs that they have that need to be tended to. And you need help. If you don't have someone or someones in your class that are helping you attend to shepherding your class, ask God to show you who could help you or to bring somebody to you. Because they have physical needs, they have prayer needs, they have emotional needs, relational needs. And there's no way that you as their shepherd can meet all of those needs, regardless of the size of your class. Ask God to give you someone who'll come in and take either 3 to 6 names and at least on a monthly basis call them and ask them what their prayer needs are. No pastor can adequately tend to God's shepherd. He needs deacons who deacon and help with that matter as well. Because this is very important that God's people be cared for. He said, I'm about to attend to you because of your evil acts. They just simply did bad stuff. Now there's a promise that comes in verse 3. And the commentators say the strong grammatical emphasis of the passage is on the word I. And you can see it when you read it. Verse 3, I will gather the remnant of my flock, that's the promise, from all the lands where I have banished them, and I will return them to their grazing land. They will become fruitful and numerous. That goes back to Genesis, where God commanded Adam and Eve to be fruitful and generous. So there's a new garden that's going to be established with God's people. It's a tremendous word of hope. And then notice verse 4, I will raise up shepherds over them who will tend them. Now we know that when he gathered them back from the exile, that some of the shepherds that he gave them were Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. And then a few years after that, there were Zechariah and Haggai and Malachi. And then there's this 400-year gap, and we come to the arrival of Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ called 12 apostles who also were given the responsibility of tending and caring for the sheep. And then we're told that those men passed it off to faithful men. And so God gave them shepherds who would attend to them. And notice, they will no longer be afraid or discouraged, nor will any be missing. The difference is as great as night and day. What God promises with these new shepherds is there's going to be a new day. Imagine no longer being afraid, no longer being discouraged. These people were living in the midst of war, and God promises to bring them peace. This is the Lord's declaration. This idea of none being missing is a promise of genuine hope for them. So this is a great promise that God makes to them because of these new shepherds. Now you simply can't let things drift. A pastor, a friend of mine, a mentor, told me about when he was young and he had children. His wife had a physical condition that would just nearly drive her to the edge of insanity, and she was extremely difficult to live with. And the way he handled it was by immersing himself in the work of the ministry and in the pursuit of his education. And the result was he, in a sense, abandoned his children to their mother at a time that she was in no condition to be a mother. Well, the consequences of that were difficult for the family. The children grew up to be rebellious, and then later as adults they had a very difficult relationship with their mother that he had to go in and exercise some strength and some leadership to bring the mother and the children back together. He apologized to the children. He said, what happened was my fault. I abandoned you. And what I'm saying to you is there are serious repercussions when we drift in our leadership. So let me ask you a question. Where are you neglecting your leadership? Is there a relationship that comes to mind that if you exercise just a little bit more time or concern, it might actually have an impact on that relationship, but you're discouraged or you don't want to make the investment, and so you've neglected it. Maybe it's an issue of money. Maybe you've not disciplined yourself with a budget, or maybe you haven't planned for expenses that come unexpectedly, or maybe you haven't taken care of your family's future. You know, the scriptures are very strong about a husband caring for his family. Maybe it's a matter of health. A friend of mine was at a pharmacy and he was waiting on his wife, and just for a lark, he sat down at one of those machines that gives you your blood pressure. He's healthy looking, he's young. He put his arm in there and he had almost stroke level blood pressure. Somehow they asked the pharmacist about it, and the pharmacist asked them to promise him he would go directly to the emergency room. And he's now on blood pressure medicine. It could be something as simple as putting on some sneakers and going for a walk and doing it on a consistent, but you've been neglecting it, and this is part of your leadership. What about spiritual disciplines? Have you been neglecting Bible study? Have you been neglecting prayer? What about reaching out to those who are lost or unaffiliated with the church? My point that I'm saying is God has called us to be new shepherds. Judah's leaders failed. They were concerned with their own interests. And God spoke very strongly about that. And so God's calling us to be new shepherds. The second thing that you see in this is point 2, and that is a righteous branch. Verses 5 through 8. Now, when we get a new leader, our expectations make us hopeful. We're going to get a new coach for the football team. And this year they're going to be winners. We're going to get a new person into office, and we think that this person's actually going to be able to keep their promises, and it's going to be a new day. We have a new manager come, replacing the old manager that we didn't like, and so things are going to work better, and the environment at work is going to be better. We have a new teacher, not a boring teacher, but this teacher has a good reputation, so we have hope of enjoying the class, or we get a new relationship. We believe they're going to bring us joy. They're going to bring us success or security or peace or something of that nature. Well, let me tap into your cynicism. And I want to ask the class, in time, what are you going to discover as reality? In time, what are you going to discover about this new leader? And it's just reality. Now, I know that's kind of a negative way to start things, and I did say I'm tapping into the cynicism, but when they respond, one of the things you can do to get more out of them and encourage discussion is just simply say, well, tell me more. And then I'm going to lead into this. In 350 years, Judah had 20 kings, and only 8 of those kings were good kings. The last one was a quarter of a century past, and all of the godliness, all of the good influence that he had brought into the nation had been wiped out. So in light of that, I want us to see this new leader, this righteous branch. And so I'll have someone read through it, and then I'm asking them, what are the characteristics of this promised leader? And again, I'm wanting that to help me be able to deal with the text. There's much about this righteous branch. If you have time, you may want to dig into that a little bit more. Notice in verse 5, he will reign wisely as king and administer justice and righteousness in the land. The idea of wisdom is you make the right choices with the information that you have, and the overtone is it leads to success. So this king is going to be successful. And what he's going to do is administer justice and righteousness in the land. Righteousness is a standard of goodness. And this man's going to apply that standard fairly and consistently. And imagine what a wonderful thing that would be to live in a land that administered justice and righteousness consistently. In verse 6, in his days Judah will be saved and Israel will dwell securely. That'll be the result of his ruling. And this is the name he will be called. The Lord is our righteous. And the word there is not only is he righteous, but he's our righteous. He lives in such a way that it produces righteousness within us. And then verse 7 and 8, this new king is going to be so successful that he's going to bring a deliverance that overshadows the Exodus. Now, you have to understand that the Old Testament is built around the Exodus. The Genesis leads up to the children of Israel being in Egypt. And then Exodus, they are brought out by this miraculous work of God, and they're there in the Sinai desert for those 40 years. And the rest of the Old Testament is teasing out the implications of the Exodus. It's huge. It's still celebrated today in Jewish life in the Passover. And what he's saying is unbelievable. What this righteous branch is going to do is bring a deliverance that is even greater than the Exodus. And we see this in Jesus Christ. He sets people free, not from bondage in Egypt. He sets people free from the bondage of sin and death and hell. He leads them not to the promised land. He leads them to the eternal home in heaven. And the impact is way exceeding of the Exodus. So this is the righteous branch, and you can go into those texts and explain that. And here's how I want to apply it. Since the lesson summary statement says God promises to give his people a trustworthy, righteous ruler, my first application in this point is, what can you trust Jesus about your past? What can you trust Jesus about your past? And one of the things I'm going to be personally talking about is permanent forgiveness. That exceeds the Exodus. The Exodus could never provide permanent forgiveness. Think about the freedom that so many people you know could experience if they genuinely received and actually believed that their past sin is forgiven. And it is forgiven forever, never to be brought back up. That is certainly a deliverance that exceeds the Exodus. Second question is, what can you trust Jesus about your present? And I hope to get several answers on that. One of the things I'm wanting to bring out is Jesus transforms us in our present. He says the Lord is our righteousness. There is the real possibility of progressive change when you become a follower in Jesus Christ. The whole world looking for transformation. Our radio and television ads are filled with stories of transformation, hope of transformation. You can't go to the grocery store and check out without these blaring headlines on magazines and newspapers talking about transformation. And here is a reality that you can be transformed through Jesus Christ. He is our righteousness. That exceeds the Exodus. There was no hope of transformation. In fact, Jeremiah is going to say, what we need is a new heart. And then last of all, what can you trust Jesus about the future? What can you trust Jesus about the future? And again, I'm sure there'll be many answers to that, wonderful answers. One of the things I hope to bring out is your future can't be canceled. Your future is beyond imagination. Your future means you are going to be fully saved. You're going to be transformed into the likeness of Jesus Christ. That is a deliverance that exceeds anything promised in the Exodus. the last point is impending disaster. So the first 8 verses, he's talking about this new leader. This is what God's going to do for his people. The second is this impending disaster on false teachers. Now notice he says in verse 9, concerning the prophets, he's talking about the false teachers, my heart is broken within me and all my bones tremble. Now I want to ask the class this question. What does it mean to be heartbroken? I looked in the dictionary and it said deep sorrow or distressed, associated with irreparable loss. Recently I did a funeral for a young couple that lost a baby a day after it was born. That is irreparable loss. If God should lead them to be old men, an old man and an old woman, and they have other children, they will never get over the baby they lost. There'll always be a tenderness. There'll always be a sorrow. There'll always be a tear when they think back to the one baby they lost, because losing that baby is heartbreaking. This is the power of what's happening with Jeremiah. And so what is it that he's heartbroken over? False teachers. He's heartbroken over the consequence of false teaching in the land, the destruction it brings to people. If you have a bad king or you have bad kings, the result is an unjust society. And when you have an unjust society, the innocent suffer. But when you have false teachers who plague the land, they don't leave society suffering. They leave society sick and perverse. And this is what Jeremiah sees in Judah in this day. These teachers are lying. They're supposed to bring people closer to God. They're supposed to help people develop a relationship with God. And instead they're taking people in the other direction. And it leaves people sick in their spirit. It leaves people perverse. Is there anyone or anything you are mourning over? Is there anything or anyone that you get choked up about? A tear comes to your eye because they're living and listening to false teaching, and it's leading their life into destruction, and their life is sick because of it. There's a movie that's come out recently. I haven't been to it. It's got Jim Caviezel in it, and the movie is about children who are being sold into all kinds of slavery. And it's the story of a man that sees this, and he becomes so passionate about it. He rescues these children, and he's so passionate about it that some way, somehow, he has raised the money to produce a full-length movie that is now playing in hundreds of movies. His hope is that it will be like Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it will cause millions of people to stand up and say, this has to stop. This is a man who mourns when he sees that, and it moves him to do something. Then I would read through the rest of these verses 10 through 12. It's very powerful. Let me just mention something in verse 12. It says, therefore they will be driven away and fall down there, for I will bring disaster on them the year of their punishment. I skipped the first part of verse 2. Therefore their way will seem like slippery paths in gloom. And the idea is the slippery path takes them further and further towards their destruction. Now to close the lesson, in the Go Explore the Bible study that I referred to at the beginning of the lesson, it has 3 ways to address the issue of leadership that's causing people to leave the workforce or to leave the place of business. And I took these 3 and I put them on a half sheet of paper And I'm going to give these to the class members and just ask them to take time this week to meditate through these. Number one, leadership challenges must be acknowledged and addressed. It's just got to start there. Where is it I'm failing in my leadership? Where am I not giving attention to something? Number two, leaders must be provided with training and resources to help them become better leaders. What do I need to know? What do I need to do? Who can I talk to that will help me be a better leader when it comes to my family or it comes to my finances? Number three, leaders must evaluate themselves honestly to identify how they can improve as leaders. Listen, tell yourself the truth. This is a powerful lesson, a needed lesson for us in our day. God bless you.